Chapter 1. The Altar Bleeds. First Cathedral had been dressed for a celebration it would never finish. White roses lined every pew, their petals already browning at the edges, as though the blooms themselves understood something the 500 guests did not, that this wedding was less a union and more a transaction. Dressed in silk and candles smoke to look like love. Ivory tapers burned in iron candelabras 20 feet tall, throwing gold light across vaulted stone ceilings, illuminating centuries of painted saints who stared down at the congregation with expressions Sira had always read as pity. Tonight, she was certain of it. Serafini Voss stood at the mouth of the nave in a gown that weighed 40 pounds and felt like a coffin. Her father had chosen it. Her father had chosen most things about this day. The cathedral, the flowers, the groom, the terms of the contract that would be signed in the vestibule after the ceremony was complete. The gown was simply the most elegant cage in a long line of them. She breathed in shallow increments. Her bouquet trembled at the end of the aisle. Edmund Ashford waited. 42, silver-tongued, impeccably tailored, and the principal creditor of the Voss family's ruined banking house. He had called this wedding a mercy. Sira had heard her father use the same word. She'd stopped trusting that word entirely 3 months ago, when the engagement was announced without her knowledge at a dinner she hadn't been invited to attend. The organ surged. The congregation rose. She walked. "You can do this," she told herself. "You have survived worse." She wasn't sure that was true, but the lie moved her feet forward, and sometimes that was enough. She was 12 steps from the altar when the doors behind her exploded open, not metaphorically, not dramatically, in the way of jilted lovers or feuding families. The ancient oak doors that had stood for 400 years, doors carved with scenes of divine judgment, simply ceased to exist in a single concussive burst of cold air and shadow. Splinters rained across the last pew. Women screamed. Men lurched to their feet. The candles along the entire left wall guttered and died in one breath, as if exhaled by something vast. Serafini turned. She didn't know why. Instinct, perhaps, or the deep animal awareness that the most dangerous thing in the room had just entered it, and that looking away was the more lethal choice. He stood in the ruined doorway. He was tall, not in the way of tall men, but in the way of old trees, something structural and inevitable about the height of him. He wore black so complete it seemed less like clothing and more like an extension of the dark behind him. His coat was long, its collar high, his jaw sharp beneath it. A face carved from angles and old severity, the kind of face that belonged to a portrait in a locked wing of a house no one visited. His hair was dark. His eyes, even from 40 feet away, caught the candlelight in a way that made no optical sense. They were not warm eyes. They were not cold, exactly. They were old. The oldest thing Serafini had ever seen. Inside a living face. He looked at Edmund Ashford for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at her. The entire cathedral seemed to contract. She had the disorienting certainty that he had been here before, not in this building, but in this moment, that he had stood in the ruin of something man-made and looked at her across the wreckage with that precise expression of grim, reluctant recognition. Ashford, his voice carried without volume. It didn't need volume. It was the kind of voice that moved through stone. The contract is void. The silence that followed was absolute. Edmund's face had gone the color of uncooked pastry. To his credit, he found his voice within moments. "You have no authority here. This is consecrated ground. The laws of the hollow court supersede consecrated ground, church law, civil contract, and the personal preferences of men who broker human lives for debt settlement." He walked forward. The congregation parted, not politely, not the way crowds parted for the wealthy or the powerful. They parted the way water parted, for something moving beneath the surface. Instinctively, helplessly. "I invoke prior claim 3 days ago." "You received the notice, Ashford. You proceeded anyway." Prior claim. Sira had never heard the phrase. She would learn, in the months to come, exactly what it meant under the laws of the 7 immortal houses. That any vampire lord could place a legal hold on a human already under house protection, halting all transfers of custody, contract, or coercion until the claim was adjudicated before the night court. She would learn that it was ancient, rarely used, and almost never invoked for someone who wasn't already blood-bound to a house. She would learn that he had invoked it for her. She didn't know any of this yet. She knew only that he had stopped 6 feet from her, and that up close, The strange quality of his eyes was worse or better, she couldn't determine which. They were a dark amber, almost brown, and they looked at her with an intensity that felt less like desire and more like recognition. Like grief. "You're frightened," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't comfort, either. It was simply an observation, delivered with the flat precision of someone cataloging facts in hostile terrain. "Yes," she said. Because she was. But she was also inexplicably, infuriatingly less frightened than she had been 12 minutes ago. Standing at the mouth of this aisle, walking toward a man who had purchased her, something shifted in his expression. Almost imperceptible. A single degree of softening that she suspected, correctly, he hadn't intended. "That will change," he said. Then, quieter, meant only for her, "Come with me or stay. But if you stay, I cannot protect you from what Ashford's creditors will do when this contract dissolves, and they need someone to punish for the loss." She looked back at Edmund, at her father in the second pew, who was not standing, who had not stood when the doors broke, who was looking at his hands. She picked up her 40-pound gown. She walked toward the ruined doors. She did not look back. Chapter 2. The house that shadows Bill's carriage was not a carriage. It was a black vehicle with tinted windows so dark they reflected the city back at itself like obsidian mirrors. And it moved through the streets of Velmore with the smooth, unhurried authority of something that had never once been stopped at a traffic light. Serafini sat pressed against the far door, her wedding gown pooled around her like a tide. She couldn't escape, her bouquet abandoned somewhere on the cathedral steps. Her hands were folded in her lap with a precision that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the fact that if she unfolded them, they would shake. He sat across from her, not beside her. The distance felt deliberate, a concession, she would later understand, to the particular terror of enclosed spaces shared with apex predators. He had not spoken since the cathedral. The city scrolled past the windows' gaslit storefronts, cobblestone intersections, the occasional pedestrian who stepped back from the curb as the vehicle passed without understanding why. Velmore was an old city, the kind built in geological layers, Roman foundations beneath medieval stone, beneath Victorian iron, beneath modern glass. It remembered things. Its bones held old violence the way old bones held old injuries, quietly, permanently, in the architecture of how it moved. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked. "Somewhere safe." He was looking out his window. His profile was severe in the passing light, the kind of face that looked most itself in darkness, she thought. Most honest. Safe according to whose definition? He turned then, slowly. The amber eyes found her in the dimness with an ease that confirmed several things she had been carefully not confirming since the cathedral. "Mine. That's not reassuring." "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine it is." She studied him for a moment. The controlled stillness of him. The way he occupied the seat without sprawling or shifting, or doing any of the small unconscious things living bodies did when confined. He was simply present in it, the way a statue was present in a room. "You're hurt," she said. He said nothing. "Your left side. You've been favoring it since the cathedral. When you turned to face Ashford, you adjusted your coat to compensate for something beneath it." She paused. "I noticed things. I've had to, for the first time." Something moved in his expression that wasn't control. A fractional reassessment, perhaps. The way a chess player looks at a board after an unexpected move. "Ashford's associates anticipated the prior claim," he said finally. "They send a representative to discourage it. 3 nights ago, they stabbed you. They tried something considerably worse." He shifted, minimally, and she caught the faint tightness at the corner of his mouth that he didn't quite suppress. "Silver core blade, soaked in rowan ash and house-cursed sigil work. It complicates healing." She absorbed this with the measured calm of someone who had spent the last 6 months learning to absorb catastrophic information without expression. Her father's debts, the engagement, the ceremony, a vampire in a cathedral, a cursed poison wound in a dark car. She filed it alongside the rest. "What's your name?" A pause. "Caius." "Just Caius?" "Caius Marin, Lord of House Marin, the 5th immortal house of the Hollow Court." He said it the way one might recite an old address accurately, without particular feeling. "You can simply use Caius, Serafini Voss," she said. "I'd say I'm pleased to meet you, but the circumstances make that difficult to claim. Honesty is preferable." Something that might. under extreme charitable interpretation, have been the ghost of appreciation crossed his face. Most people lie reflexively when frightened. It irritates me. I used to, she said. I stopped finding it useful. The vehicle turned through a gate she hadn't seen open. The city fell away. What replaced it was stone, a structure that rose from the hillside above Velmore's old quarter like something the hill itself had decided to become. Not a castle, precisely. Not a manor. Something in the contested space between the two. Towers where towers served no architectural purpose except atmosphere and defensibility. High walls black with centuries of Velmore weather. Iron gates wrought into patterns she recognized distantly as protective sigils from her mother's old books. She had burned those books after her mother died. She wished, suddenly, that she hadn't. Inside, the house was candlelit. Not for ambience. She understood instinctively that this was simply how it was always lit, that the electricity in the walls served functional purposes and the candles served something older. The entrance hall rose 40 feet, its ceiling, a vault of dark stone. A chandelier of black iron and white tapers burning above a floor of polished obsidian marble that reflected the light like still water. A woman materialized from a side corridor. She was perhaps 60 in appearance, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, and she moved toward Caius with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing the unmanageable. She stopped when she saw his posture. Her eyes went to his left side. Dia. His voice carried warning. Don't, she said, in the tone of someone who had long ago surrendered any fear of him. She looked at Serafini with frank appraisal. You're the Voss girl. I am, Serafini said. She stays in the East Wing, Caius said. The prior claim stands until the night court convenes. She is a guest, not a ward. She is not to be restricted, and you, Dia said, are going to the physician's room before that wound finishes what Ashford's man started. She turned to Serafini with unexpected warmth. He's been poisoned for 3 days and still went to that cathedral. Stubborn as architecture. I had an obligation, Caius said flatly. You had a death wish. She gestured for Serafini to follow. Come, girl. Your room has a fire and a lock on the inside. Both courtesy of the Lord. Before you ask, Serafini followed her up a staircase of dark wood and iron banisters, and at the first landing she paused and looked back. Caius was still in the entrance hall. He was looking up at her with that same expression, the one that looked like grief wearing the mask of indifference. Like a man watching something he had already decided he could not keep. She didn't look away first, neither did he. Chapter 3. The things she noticed. Ash did not sleep the first night. This was not unusual. Sleep had been a negotiation since her mother's death 2 years ago, something she had to bargain her way into, offering her exhausted body against the protests of a mind that refused to go quiet. But in the east wing of Caius Marin's house, with a fire burning low in the grate, and a lock she had tested 3 times engaged on the inside of the door, she lay in a bed the size of her entire previous bedroom and listened to the house breathe. It did breathe. That was the strange thing. Old houses always held sound differently than new ones. Settled timber, stones that contracted in the cold, the particular acoustics of walls built to hold something in or keep something out. But this house had a rhythm. Slow, deliberate, almost respiratory. She lay there and counted it, and decided, sometime around 3 in the morning, that it wasn't the house at all. It was him. Moving through it. She heard footsteps below, unhurried, measured, the particular cadence of someone who walked not to arrive somewhere but because stillness had become intolerable. Back and forth, in the room directly beneath hers. She pressed her ear once briefly to the floor, and heard something else beneath the footsteps. The low sound of pages turning, books. He was reading at 3 in the morning while poisoned with silver and rowan ash. Walking between shelves in the room beneath her feet, she added this to the list she had already started. By the end of the second day, the list was considerable. He did not eat. She had taken breakfast and lunch in the East Wing sitting room, brought by a quiet young man named Pell, who had the efficient manner of someone trained to answer exactly the questions asked of him and volunteer nothing further. She had asked him, on his second visit, what Lord Marin took for meals. Pell had paused for precisely 2 seconds before saying, His Lordship manages his own needs, which told her everything and nothing. In the most precise possible balance, he moved through the house between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon at a reduced pace. Not slow exactly, but careful. The way someone moved when managing pain they refused to acknowledge. She had come to understand the geography of the house enough by the second day to recognize that the internal rooms, the library and the long corridor and the deep withdrawing room, received no natural light. He stayed in those till sunset. Something changed. She was in the East Wing library. Her library for the duration of the prior claim. Dia had explained with casual authority on the second morning when she heard his stride alter in the corridor outside. The careful, conserving quality of his daytime movement gave way to something easier and more natural, the way a held breath releases. She had looked up from the book she was reading, an old volume of Hollow Court histories she had found on the third shelf, and watched the gap beneath the closed door as his shadow passed. Faster, quieter, the full, unhurried authority of him restored. She knew what that meant. She had read enough of her mother's burned books before she burned them to recognize the shape of it. She went looking for him on the third day, not because she had decided to trust him. She was nowhere near that, but because observation at a distance had limits. And she had always been the kind of person who understood things better when she could see them clearly. And she had been kept from clarity for long enough in her life that the impulse toward it was nearly involuntary now. She found him in the east courtyard at dusk. He was standing at the center of it, a space enclosed on all sides by the house's inner walls, open only to the sky, which was doing the particular thing it did in Velmore at this hour, burning from gold to deep violet at the horizon, with a red seam between that looked like a wound closing. He was reading a document, sleeves rolled despite the cold, and she noticed immediately that his left arm was bare of the bandagging she had glimpsed on the first night. The wound was gone, not healed in the way human wounds healed. The graduated process of scabbing, inflammation, fading scar, gone in the total, radical way of something that had simply ceased. Smooth skin where the injury had been, and she would have doubted her memory of the blood she'd seen on his coat in the carriage, except for the way he held that arm still when she watched, not in pain, but with the particular awareness of recent structural violence. The memory of injury after the injury had departed. "You're staring," he said, without looking up. "You were dying 3 days ago." Dying is a relative term, is it? She stepped into the courtyard. The cold hit her properly, and she pulled her borrowed coat. Dia had sourced an entire wardrobe with the mysterious efficiency of someone who had done this before tighter. The wound is gone. Vampire physiology. He turned a page. Given time and rest, most damage resolves. Silver and sigil work complicated the timeline, but not past the point of resolution. Not this time. He finally looked up. The dusk light did something to his face, softened the severity of it, found the planes of it in amber rather than shadow, and she noticed, not for the first time, that he was watching her with that same quality of careful attention he gave to everything. Like she was a document he was reading for secondary meanings. "You've been mapping the house." She didn't bother denying it. "And you, and me." He set the document down on the low stone wall beside him. "You've noticed the light, and the sleeping hours, and the eating." She paused. "Or the not eating." Something shifted in his expression. Not discomfort precisely, but proximity to it. "We should discuss the terms of your stay," he said. "Not the court terms. The practical ones. I'd prefer to discuss what you are first. You already know. I want to hear you say it." He looked at her steadily. The violet sky above the courtyard deepened. The first star became visible, directly overhead, and she noticed him notice it. A fractional upward glance, entirely involuntary. The way someone glances towards something that has always oriented them. "I'm what the histories call a first turned," he said. "Made in the 3rd century. I don't use the common word. It's imprecise, and it carries mythology. I don't subscribe to." He picked up the document again, in a way that might have been deliberate de-escalation. "I am what I am, Serafini. I should warn you that curiosity about it will not end well for your peace of mind." "My peace of mind hasn't been intact for 2 years," she said. "I'm not protecting it anymore." He looked at her again. Longer this time. The same fractional reassessment she'd seen in the carriage, but slower, deeper. "Come in when it gets dark," he said finally. "The outer wards weaken between moonrise and midnight while the court recalibrates the sigil lines. Until they're reset, proximity to the exterior walls isn't advisable." It was not. "I will tell you more." It was not warmth or welcome, but it was a warning issued for her safety, volunteered without being asked, from a man who had not asked anything of her yet. Not her blood, not her gratitude, not her compliance. She filed that too. Chapter 4. What grief looks like in the dark. It started with tea, not a grand gesture, not the orchestrated tenderness of someone performing care for effect. Simply a cup of tea left outside the East Wing library door on the fourth morning. Black, no sugar, the exact temperature of something brewed and then set aside for precisely 12 minutes to cool. She knew the 12 minutes because she had been awake when Pell brought it, had heard him set it down and leave, and had opened the door to find it sitting on the old wooden tray beside a single object she had not expected, her mother's book. One of them, not burned after all, or rather, a copy she had never seen, older than the edition she had destroyed, its cover worn smooth with handling. The Recorded Laws of the Seven Immortal Houses, annotated edition. 1847. She opened it to the first page and found marginalia in a hand she did not recognize. Precise, slanted, occasionally sardonic. This translation is imprecise. The original Aramaic covenant contains a conditional clause the translator omitted, likely deliberately. And lower, Ashford will try to cite this passage in the debt proceedings. He'll be wrong. He had been reading it recently. With her situation specifically in mind, she took the tea and the book back inside and sat with both for a long time. Trust, she had learned in the wreckage of the past 2 years, was not a door you opened. It was a window you cracked, incrementally, testably, ready to close at the first sign of smoke. She cracked it now by 1 degree, and watched to see what came through. What came through, on the 5th day, was an invitation. Dia delivered it in person, which meant it was important. His lordship asks if you would join him in the lower library this evening, after sunset. He says. She paused, with the faint expression of someone relaying a message they found mildly exasperating, that he has information relevant to the night court hearing and believes you should be present for it. He also says to tell you it's entirely optional, and that he'll leave a written summary outside your door if you prefer not to come. Serafini considered. He actually said entirely optional? Twice. He was very specific about it. She went. The lower library was the room beneath her bedroom. She recognized it by the footstep geography she had memorized on the first night. It was larger than she'd imagined, its walls consumed by bookshelves that rose to a ceiling she could barely see. A fireplace broad enough to stand inside, burning at the far end. 2 deep chairs positioned before it with the particular arrangement of furniture that had been moved and moved again across many decades until it found the configuration that worked. She noticed there were 2 cups on the low table between them. He had anticipated her answer. She sat in the chair that faced the fire. He was already in the other, a ledger open across his knee. And he looked up when she entered with an expression that was not quite relief, but occupied the same emotional territory. The night court convenes in 9 days, he said. I want you to understand the proceedings before we arrive, so I'm not blindsided, so you can make informed choices. He closed the ledger. The prior claim I invoked gives you protected status under house law. It means Ashford cannot legally enforce any contract, transfer, or claim against you while the claim stands, but it requires me to demonstrate justification before the court. He paused. I'll need to explain why House Marin had prior interest in your protection. She looked at him steadily. Did it? Before the cathedral, I mean. Did you know who I was? A long pause. The fire shifted, throwing new light across the angles of his face. Your mother, he said, was under House Marin's informal protection for the last 4 years of her life. She came to me to the house after your father's debts became dangerous. She asked for help navigating the court's jurisdiction over human financial coercion. I couldn't save the fortune, but I ensured that certain collectors understood the family had house awareness. He stopped. When she died, the protection lapsed. It requires a conscious holder to maintain. You were 18. I didn't. Another pause. This one carrying something heavier. I should have made contact sooner. Serafini felt the words land in her chest with the particular weight of information that rearranged things. She never told me. She was protecting you from knowledge that comes with a cost. His voice was careful. Not gentle exactly, but handled gently. The way one handles something that might break, not from fragility, but from the specific angle of the damage it already carries. She was a perceptive woman, principled. She understood what accepting house awareness meant, and she accepted it anyway, because she loved you more than she feared. The implications? Serafini looked at the fire. The familiar press of grief she had lived beside for 2 years was there, but something in it had shifted. A small, terrible comfort in the knowledge that her mother had fought for her in ways she hadn't known to see. "You knew her well enough to mourn her," he said, simply, without ornament. She looked at him, then looked at him properly, the way she'd been building toward for days. He was not looking at the fire, or the ledger, or the middle distance. He was looking at his own hands, folded over the closed ledger, and there was something in his expression she recognized with the accuracy of someone who had worn it herself. The stripped, private quality of grief that had nowhere left to put itself. The particular exhaustion of mourning someone for whom no formal ceremony existed, because the relationship was too old or too complicated or too quietly real to be publicly claimed. "How long ago did you last mourn someone?" she asked. He looked up. The amber eyes held something unguarded for a single, undefended moment. "Longer than you've been alive," he said. "Several times over." She nodded. Not in pity. She understood instinctively that pity would close him like a wound. In recognition. "That's a particular kind of tired," she said. "Carrying grief with no one who remembers the person with you." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet, open in the small, specific way of someone surprised by being understood. Unsteady at the edges. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is exactly what it is." The fire burned. Outside the deep library windows, Velmore glittered below the hill, its lights scattered like fallen stars in the cold. She tucked her feet beneath her in the chair, a small, unconscious, claiming of comfort, and reached for the annotated house laws on the table beside her cup. "Tell me what I need to know about the night court," she said. He told her. For 3 hours, until the fire burned to embers, he told her everything. Chapter 5. The houses that Hunt's message arrived nailed to the outer gate, not slid beneath a door or delivered through conventional channels. Nailed. With a spike of black iron driven through the center of a wax seal, the color of dried arterial blood. Pell found it at dawn, and brought it to Dia, who brought it to Caius, who read it once, folded it with the precise economy of someone suppressing a significant reaction, and placed it in the inside breast pocket of his coat. He did all of this before Serafini had come down for breakfast. She knew something had changed before she reached the bottom stair. The house had a different quality to its silence, tighter. The way air tightened before a storm when the pressure dropped and every living thing adjusted its posture without knowing why. She found Dia in the entrance hall, directing 2 young men she hadn't seen before to reposition iron fixtures along the lower windows. Protective sigils, she recognized from the annotated house law's exterior ward reinforcements, deployed when active threat was anticipated rather than routine. "What happened?" Serafini asked. Dia looked at her with the measuring expression of someone deciding how much honesty was appropriate and then electing for all of it. House Vale sent a declaration of contested claim. They're arguing that Lord Marin's prior claim was filed improperly because it names a human with no formal blood contract to the house. Under the old covenants, an informal protection like the one your mother held doesn't automatically transfer by bloodline without a renewal ceremony. She paused. They're not wrong, technically. It's a narrow argument. But House Vale specializes in narrow arguments. Serafini absorbed this. And if the Night Court agrees, then the prior claim dissolves, and you revert to unprotected status under court jurisdiction. Dia said it plainly, without softening it. Which means Ashford's contract becomes enforceable again, and House Vale can file their own competing claim. What does House Vale want with me? Dia's expression shifted. Not evasion, something more careful. The look of someone who knew the answer and was deciding if the telling would help or harm. That's a question for Lord Marin. She found him in the lower library. He was standing at the large table that occupied the room's center, which was now covered in documents, house law texts, correspondence in languages she couldn't identify, maps of Velmore that showed not streets, but something older beneath them, territorial demarcations in faded ink that divided the city into sectors she'd never known existed. He was cross-referencing 3 things simultaneously, and hadn't heard her enter, or had chosen not to acknowledge it. And she used the moment to study him the way she studied everything she needed to understand. Completely without sentiment, he was afraid. Not in any way that would have been legible to someone who hadn't spent 6 days learning his specific vocabulary of expression and suppression. But it was there, the fractional tension in his jaw, The way his stillness had lost its resting quality and become instead the stillness of a man holding himself together through deliberate force. "Tell me about House Vale," she said. He looked up, made no pretense of being unsurprised by her directness. "Sit down. Tell me first." A pause. Then, with the air of someone who had learned arguing with her was inefficient, "House Vale is the second immortal house. Old money, old blood, old grievances. Their lord is Mordecai Vale, first turned, like me, though significantly younger. 400 years to my 1800. He turned from the table. "We have history, hostile history, the kind that doesn't end." He moved to the fireplace. Not for warmth. She understood by now that warmth was largely irrelevant to him, but because it gave him something to look at that wasn't her. 80 years ago, there was a human woman under House Marin's formal protection. A scholar. She was researching the original blood covenant documents, the founding agreements between the 7 houses and the human governing bodies that allowed vampire houses to operate within mortal cities. Mordecai wanted those documents. He believed they contained suppressed clauses that would give House Vale legal dominion over 3 of the other 5 houses, including mine. He stopped. She died before she finished her work. House Vale's methods of persuasion are not subtle. The silence that followed was the kind that carried weight. "You couldn't protect her," Serafini said. "I was in the Eastern Territories negotiating a separate covenant dispute. I was 3 days too late." His voice was flat in the way of something that had been processed many times over many decades and still, apparently, had not finished hurting. Mordecai was censured by the Night Court, minimally, insufficiently. He turned from the fire. "He has been waiting for an opportunity to revisit the question of those documents ever since, and I'm the opportunity. Your mother was the scholar," he said quietly. "Her research didn't die with her. I preserved what she had completed and kept it within House Marin's archive. Mordecai has known this for 2 years. He also knows that you were her daughter, that you grew up reading her work, and that you are by his calculation either a means of accessing what remains of it, or a liability to be neutralized before you become one." Serafini felt the pieces assemble with the cold, lucid precision of understanding, arriving at exactly the wrong time. "He wants my mother's research. He wants what it proves. If the suppressed covenant clauses exist and can be authenticated, it restructures the entire political architecture of the Hollow Court. Several houses would lose their current standing, mine included, though that concerns me less than the human corollary. The protective agreements that keep mortal cities from becoming active hunting grounds would be void." He met her eyes. "It is not a small thing, Serafini. It is the difference between the arrangement that currently exists imperfect, sometimes brutal, but governed, and something considerably darker." She stood very still, processing the weight of it. Outside, the wind moved through the courtyard with a sound like something circling. "How many humans," she said slowly, "are currently living under house protection agreements in Velmore alone?" His expression told her the number was significant before he said it. "Approximately 14,000. She sat down. "The Night Court hearing is in 8 days, he continued. "If the prior claim holds, we have time and legal standing to fight Vale's challenge. If it dissolves," he stopped. "Then we stop it from dissolving," she said. Her voice was steady. She noticed distantly that she had said we. He noticed too. Something moved through his expression. The ghost of that unguarded look from the library. The one that looked like being surprised by warmth in a place that had been cold for a very long time. "There is something you should know," he said. "Mordecai will not wait for the court hearing," as if answering him. The outer ward alarms ignited along every window in the house. A low, resonant vibration that traveled through the stone floors and up through the soles of her feet like a pulse, not a warning data an arrival. Chapter 6. Blood, Oath, and Ancient Nemes. The vibration died after 40 seconds, not because the threat had passed. Serafini understood that much from the way Caius moved to the library door with the controlled urgency of someone managing escalation rather than resolution. It died because the outer wards had absorbed and catalogued whatever had touched them, and were now doing something more deliberate than alarming, reporting. "Stay here," he said. "Absolutely not," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was half command and half something that had already accepted it wouldn't work. He turned and walked, and she followed, and he did not stop her. The entrance hall had transformed in the 40 seconds since the alarm. The two young men she'd seen repositioning the window fixtures were now stationed at the interior doors with an alert stillness that confirmed they were not, as she had briefly assumed, human staff. Dia stood at the base of the staircase with a long-handled instrument that looked like a candle snuffer and functioned, Serafini would later learn, as a ward conduit for channeling sigil energy from the house's protective network, perimeter probe, Dia said, without preamble. Single source. High-order vampire. House Vale's signature. They're reading our defenses, not attacking. Mordecai himself? Caius asked. No, an emissary. They're being theatrical. She said the last word with a contempt that suggested she found theatrics to be the most offensive possible offense. There's a message forming in the East Sigil line. He's encoding it through the ward network rather than delivering it conventionally. Old court manners. Caius's expression shifted into something Serafini recognized as controlled anger, not the hot, reactive kind, but the cold architectural kind that had been constructed over centuries into something almost indistinguishable from calm. He's demonstrating that he can touch our wards, she said quietly. From beside him, he glanced at her. Yes, it's a proof of capability. He wants you to know he's already inside your defenses in at least one sense. Before the court hearing, yes, he said again, with that same fractional quality of being caught off guard by her accuracy. The message materialized not in text, but in the particular way Dia had explained. Ward communication worked as a structured impression delivered through the sigil network directly to the House Lord's perception. Caius received it in 4 seconds of absolute stillness. Eyes unfocused in the way of someone reading something no one else could see. When he refocused, the controlled anger had gone somewhere deeper. What does he want? Serafini asked. He wants you delivered to House Vale's custody by midnight tomorrow. Or he files to have the prior claim invalidated on grounds of fraudulent invocation. He turned from the entrance hall, moving back toward the library. Come. She came. Inside, he did not go to the table or the fire. He went to the window, the deep, stone-set window that looked out over Velmore's scatter of lights, and stood with his back to her for long enough that she understood he was deciding something. Not tactically. The tactics he had already sorted. He was deciding about her. Sit down, he said. There are things I should have told you before this reached the acute stage. She sat. He turned. The prior claim I filed is technically valid, he began, but Mordecai is correct that it sits on uncertain legal ground without the formal blood contract renewal. The informal protection your mother held was a gentleman's agreement. By court standards, it carried moral weight but limited legal force. He paused. To make the claim unassailable before the court, I need to establish a formal bond between House Marin and you. She kept her expression steady. What does that mean specifically? There are 3 forms of formal bond under the old covenants. He said it with the air of someone reading from a document he found personally distasteful. Oath bond, a mutual declaration before the night court, witnessed and sealed. Service bond, a contracted arrangement of defined term and purpose. And blood bond, the oldest and most legally absolute. A shared blood covenant that writes both parties into the house record at the cellular level. You're not asking me for the third one, she said. It wasn't a question. She had watched him carefully enough to know the shape of what he would and wouldn't ask. I would never ask that without a conversation that would take significantly longer than 8 days and require considerably more trust than we currently have. His voice was flat, but it carried something beneath the flatness, a precision that felt principled. The oath bond is what I'm proposing. A formal declaration of mutual protection and acknowledgement before the court. It gives you legal standing within House Marin without requiring blood exchange or indefinite commitment. You can petition to dissolve it after the hearing, if you choose. And the blood bond, she said slowly. What exactly does it do? To both parties. He was quiet for a moment. Then, it creates a permanent perceptual connection. Not telepathic. Nothing as crude as that. More like an awareness of survival status, emotional register. The old covenants called it sanguine resonance. It cannot be dissolved by petition. It fades only with the death of one party. He stopped. It is not something I would propose lightly, or at all, to someone who hadn't chosen it with full knowledge. Have you ever done it? With anyone? The window light was behind him, throwing his face into partial shadow. Once, he said, in the 6th century. She died in the 9th. I felt it. He said nothing more. And the nothing carried the weight of 1300 years. Serafini sat with that for a moment. The image of him carrying that specific loss across more centuries than her entire civilization had been recorded. The intimacy of it. The absolute unresolvable loneliness. "Tell me about the blood oaths you carry," she said. "The ones that bind you to the house system. Not the law. The personal ones." He looked at her as if she had asked something no one had asked before, or asked it in a way no one had framed it. "Why?" "Because you went to that cathedral poisoned with silver and rowan ash, 3 days after being attacked, to stop a contract being enforced on a woman you'd never met. And the court law explains the mechanics of that. But it doesn't explain the reason." The fire behind her was the only sound for a long moment. "My maker," he said finally, "bound me with a founding oath when he turned me in the 3rd century. The terms were simple. House Marin would hold dominion over its claimed territory, and in exchange, it would serve as protector of the mortal population within that territory. Not as property. Not as resource." His voice had shifted, older somehow, as if the cadence of it had traveled back toward the century it came from. He believed that what we became required an ethical architecture to survive without becoming monstrous. "The oath was the architecture, and you've kept it, for 1800 years, he said it without pride, with the weight of someone who understood that 1800 years of anything was both achievement and sentence. Not perfectly, not without cost, but the principle has held, because he asked you to. Your maker? Because I watched what happened to the houses that didn't." His eyes found hers across the room. "Mordecai Vale is what an immortal becomes without an ethical architecture. I have had 1800 years to observe the alternative." Serafini held his gaze. Outside the window, Velmore glittered, 14,000 people sleeping under protections they would never know existed. Dependent on a blood oath made in the 3rd century by a man standing across this library, looking at her with ancient, exhausted, unwavering conviction. "I'll take the oath bond," she said. "And I want it in writing, with the dissolution clause. Before we go before the court." Something moved through his expression, the relief of someone who had braced for a different answer and found the ground still solid. "In writing," he agreed. "Every clause." She nodded. Once, somewhere below the east ward, the Vale emissary withdrew into the night. But what Mordecai had sent was not gone. It lingered in the sigil lines like smoke after a fire, the promise of something larger coming. 8 days. The night court. And a war between houses that a human woman had just walked into, on her own terms, with her eyes fully open. Chapter 7. What humans know about Phyrethi came on the 6th night, not at midnight, as theatrical convention might have dictated. Not at the deepest hour of darkness, when Gothic imagination placed its monsters. They came at 10:43 in the evening, when the house was still partially lit, and Serafini was in the lower library, with 3 volumes of House Covenant law open across the table, cross-referencing the dissolution clause language Caius had drafted with the annotated 1847 edition her mother had apparently trusted with her life. She had been finding discrepancies, small ones, the kind that only mattered if you were standing before a court that would use precision as a weapon, and had been about to go find Caius to discuss them when every candle in the library extinguished simultaneously. Not the fire, just the candles. The fire burned on, confused and defiant. She was already moving when Dia appeared in the doorway. "East and North wards are down," she said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone running on training rather than calm. "They didn't probe this time. They collapsed them. 3 high-order Vale vampires, minimum, working the sigil network from underneath." "Where's Caius?" "East courtyard. He went out to reinforce the exterior ward anchor when the alarm fired. He doesn't know the inner wards are gone." Serafini was already picking up the candle holder. "Heavy iron, the kind that doubled as architecture from the table's edge. Which means he's outside, and the protections that should be behind him no longer exist. The Vale party will know that. They'll drive him inward, and when he crosses the threshold, expecting the inner wards, he'll walk into nothing." She moved past Dia into the corridor, mind running fast and cold. "How many of them?" "The ward collapse suggests 3 attackers working in concert, possibly a 4th. Managing the sigil disruption remotely." Dia matched her stride. "We have Pell and the 2 ward keepers, but they're human adjacent at best. Trained, but not match quality for high-order Vale. What's in this house that can hurt a high-order vampire? Not kill. Hurt enough to interrupt concentration." Dia looked at her sharply. "Why?" Because the sigil disruption is the threat. The 3 physical attackers are the distraction. If someone is holding the ward collapse from outside the perimeter, they need sustained concentration to maintain it. If I can break that concentration, the inner wards reboot automatically. 40-second reinitialization. Dia's expression had shifted from managed alarm to something more focused. The silver reserves are in the lower cellar. Not weapons-grade raw silver, stored in salt solution for alchemical use. But silver salt solution aerosolized at close range would cause enough pain to break concentration. Yes, Serafini was already turning toward the cellar stairs. Where is the dispersal equipment? This is not what human guests do during sieges, Dia said, following her. No, Serafini agreed, descending the stairs at a pace that left no room for debate. It's what human guests do when 14,000 people's protective agreements depend on a ward network staying functional. The cellar was cold and low-ceilinged and smelled of stone and old iron. Dia moved to the alchemical stores with the efficiency of someone who had inventoried them many times over many years. Copper vessels, glass jars sealed with wax, a row of pump-action dispersal units used, apparently, for sigil maintenance work that required liquid distribution across large areas. The silver salt solution was in sealed copper containers, inert until aerosolized and exposed to air, at which point it became a fine metallic mist that would coat exposed skin and mucous membranes with enough silver contact to cause a high-order vampire several minutes of incapacitation. Several minutes was enough. She took 2 dispersal units. Dia took 1. They went up. The east courtyard entrance was through the library, and she heard the fight before she reached it. Not the sounds of movie violence, not the crash and spectacle of it, but the real sounds of 2 high-order vampires engaging a third, fast, almost below hearing. The percussion of bodies moving at speeds that left afterimages rather than clean motion. She pushed through the door. Caius was in the center of the courtyard. He was holding against 2 of them. She registered that instantly. The way he positioned himself to prevent encirclement. His movements still carrying that quality of absolute controlled authority, even as blood ran from a reopened wound along his collarbone. The silver blade from 3 nights ago, or something like it. The third veil vampire was not in the courtyard. She looked up. The third was on the exterior wall, 20 feet above, perched at the wall's apex in absolute stillness, hands pressed to the stone, eyes closed, concentrating. The ward collapse anchor, in physical contact with the wall to maintain the sigil disruption through direct touch. Serafini walked to the base of the wall, tilted the dispersal unit upward, pumped it twice and engaged the release. The silver salt mist rose in a fine column and hit the figure on the wall at chest and face level. The reaction was instantaneous and total. The concentration shattered like glass dropped on stone, a sound that was less sound than pressure. A sharp audible crack that ran through the sigil lines as they released and rebounded. The inner wards slamming back into initialization with a vibration that traveled up through the courtyard flagstones into the soles of her feet. 40 seconds. The figure on the wall fell not injured, enough to be incapacitated, but disrupted, rolling clear of the courtyard and gone over the far wall into the street below within 3 seconds of landing. The remaining 2 veil vampires felt the ward reboot simultaneously. She saw it in the way they both checked their movement, recalculating, and then the inner ward completed its reinitiation and the house's full protective network engaged at strength. The 2 veil vampires were inside the ward perimeter when it locked. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Caius said, very quietly, to the 2 veil vampires, "You are now in violation of Hollow Court Covenant 47. Unlawful presence within an active house ward under hostile intent." He was bleeding. He was furious in the cold architectural way she had come to understand was his most dangerous register. "You may surrender to House Marin custody and be delivered to the Night Court, or you may attempt to fight your way out of a fully reinitiated primary ward, which I strongly advise against." They surrendered. It took another hour to secure them. Contact the Night Court's emergency line and arrange custody transfer to the neutral house wardens, who arrived at the gate within 30 minutes. Serafini stood in the entrance hall and watched the procedural machinery of vampire law operate with the efficiency of something that had handled this exact scenario many times across many centuries. When it was done and the hall was quiet again, Caius found her still standing there. He stopped 2 feet from her. His collarbone wound had already closed. She could see the clean skin above his torn collar, the blood dried and dark against his shirt. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, and it took her a moment to identify it, because it was so unguarded as to be almost unrecognizable on his face. Gratitude. Raw, unperformed, and specific, not general appreciation, but the particular gratitude of someone who had expected to be alone in something dangerous and had not been. The ward anchor, he said. You identified it. You were managing the immediate threat, she said. Someone had to manage the mechanism. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was working through a private reckoning. She could see it. The slow adjustment of whatever internal accounting he kept about her, about this. About what it meant that she had walked into his war with a pump-action dispersal unit and changed the outcome. You could have stayed in the cellar, he said. Yes, she agreed. I could have. He reached up slowly, with a deliberateness that announced itself as choice, and touched the side of her face once briefly. His hand was cool and entirely steady, and the touch was not possessive or desperate, nothing like the grasping quality of fear or desire poorly managed. It was the touch of someone confirming that something real was still real. Then he stepped back, put the distance back between them with the same deliberateness. Thank you, he said quietly. Serafini. It was the first time he had used her name without the slight formality of full acknowledgement. Just her name. The shortened intimacy of it arrived in her chest like warmth arriving in cold hands. The specific ache of something that had been numb returning to feeling. She didn't trust herself to answer. She nodded once. He turned toward the stairs. She watched him go, and the feeling in her chest didn't quiet. And she didn't ask it to. Chapter 8. The architecture of Distancish found the crack in herself the next morning, not dramatically. Not in the way of breakdowns that announced themselves with appropriate staging. It arrived quietly, the way all the significant fractures in her life had arrived, while she was doing something ordinary, something that required no emotional attention and therefore left the back door unguarded. She was washing her hands at the basin in the east wing, and she looked up at her reflection, and the woman looking back at her was a stranger in borrowed clothes in a vampire's house. 2 days from a night court hearing that would determine whether she spent the rest of her life as a legal entity within an immortal power structure. And her hands were shaking. She sat on the edge of the bed. She let them shake for approximately 3 minutes. Then she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed through it with the practiced mechanics of someone who had learned to give grief a time limit, because the alternative was giving it everything. The siege had done something to the careful, emotional architecture she'd been constructing since the cathedral. Not destroyed it, she was not destroyed. But the adrenaline had metabolized overnight and left behind a residue of clarity she was finding inconvenient. She was frightened. She was in a situation she had not chosen, managed by laws she didn't fully understand, protected by a man whose nature she was still cataloging. And beneath all of that, worse than all of that, she was aware, with the precise and unhelpful awareness of someone who noticed things for a living, that she was no longer frightened of him specifically, that she had not been, she suspected. For several days now, she dressed and went downstairs. The house had a different quality in the siege's aftermath. Not damaged. The stone walls held their centuries without visible distress, but used in a way that showed. Dia was directing the reset of the East Courtyard ward anchors with the brisk efficiency of post-crisis management, and Pell was moving through the entrance hall with the careful attention of someone checking every surface for evidence of violation. The 2 Veil prisoners had been transferred to neutral court custody before midnight. The ward keepers had worked through the night resetting the collapsed sigil lines. It looked, she thought, like the morning after something that had not quite become a catastrophe. Caius was in the East Courtyard. She hadn't intended to go there. She'd intended the library. The covenant documents still needed cross-referencing. The dissolution clause still had 3 inconsistencies she hadn't resolved. But her feet took her to the courtyard door, and she opened it. And there he was, standing in the morning light with his back to her. In the morning light, full winter sun, pale and cold and direct. She stopped. She had understood intellectually from the house law texts, from his careful explanations, that the mythology of vampire and sunlight was precisely that. Mythology, or rather a misremembering of something more specific, that direct sunlight affected older, more powerful vampires as a profound sensory experience rather than a destructive one. not painful, overwhelming. The accumulated photonic sensitivity of a body that existed primarily in darkness, encountering full daylight was, according to the annotated text, described in the founding era records as like hearing music after centuries of silence, magnificent and briefly unbearable. She watched him stand in it. His eyes were closed. His face was turned slightly upward toward the pale winter source, and his expression, unguarded in the way of someone who believed themselves unobserved, was not rapture or agony but something between. Something she recognized, with an accuracy that cost her something to name, as the expression of a person experiencing beauty. They had no one to share it with. She must have made a sound. Or he simply felt the change in the courtyard's occupied weight. As she had come to believe, he felt most things with a physical sensitivity she was still adjusting to. He turned. The expression closed. Not entirely, not with the speed of early days, when everything had sealed like a wound at her approach. It closed slowly, the way morning light fades rather than switches off. He looked at her with the slightly undefended quality that had been accumulating between them, involuntary and mutual. Since the library and the tea, and the 3 hours of covenant law by the fire. You should have slept longer, he said. I slept enough. She stepped into the courtyard. The cold was sharp and clean, and she pulled her coat close. How's your collarbone? Resolved. He touched the place briefly, confirming. The Vale Warden sent a formal court apology this morning. Mordecai is distancing himself from the attack, claiming the operatives acted without authorization. Do you believe that? No, but it's a useful fiction for the court record. It means he's recalibrating. He didn't expect the ward reinitialization. He paused. He didn't expect you. She looked at the flagstones where the fight had been. They were clean, pale again, she assumed, or someone whose job it was to manage the physical evidence of violence with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a house that had hosted it before. Does this get easier? She asked. The aftermath, the next day quality of it. No, he said, but it gets more familiar, which is not the same thing as easier, but is marginally more survivable. He moved to the low courtyard wall and leaned against it, arms folded, in a posture she recognized as his version of rest. You're frightened today. More than last night. Last night I had something to do, she said. Today I've had time to process what I did. Regret? No, just the weight of it. Arriving late. She looked at him. Does that happen to you still? After 1800 years, does the weight still arrive? He was quiet for a long moment. The weight never stops arriving, he said. The difference is, I've built more internal architecture to receive it. A pause. You built considerable architecture under circumstances that should have collapsed it. I've been watching you manage things that would undo most people and continue to function with. He stopped. Selected a different word with the care of someone who knew the first one had been too much. With remarkable composure, she understood what the first word had been. Not composure. The knowledge of it sat between them in the cold morning air, specific and unignorable. Caius, she said carefully, what happens to you if the oath bond is established, and I decide after the court hearing to dissolve it? He met her eyes. I continue as I have for 1800 years. He said it without self-pity and without performance, simply. It would not be a new condition. The solitude. Yes, she absorbed that the sheer scale of it. 1800 years of chosen solitude as the ethical architecture required to be what he was without becoming something monstrous. The loneliness, not as flaw, but as the structural cost of principle, held across an incomprehensible span of time. That's not how it should work, she said quietly. The architecture. It shouldn't require solitude to stay ethical. He looked at her, with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him yet, not the fractional softenings and partial revelations of the past week, but something genuinely open. Like a door swung wide before the person behind it had fully decided to open it. No, he said. It shouldn't. His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man handling something he hadn't trusted himself to handle for a very long time. But I have not previously had cause to reconsider the design. Previously. That single word placed precisely where he'd placed it, carrying everything it was meant to carry. She held his gaze, and did not look away, and did not answer. Because the answer was forming in her chest in a way that needed more time and more solid ground than 2 days before a court hearing and one night past a siege, but she felt it. And from the expression on his face, quietly and unguardedly, so did he. Chapter 9. What survives the dark? There were 2 days left before the night court convened. And for the first time since the cathedral, the house was quiet, not the taut, pressurized quiet of a siege's aftermath, nor the careful quiet of 2 people managing the distance between them with deliberate architecture. A different quality entirely. The quiet of a storm's eye, genuine and temporary and strangely generous in its stillness. They both seemed to understand, without discussing it, that these 2 days were borrowed time, that what came after the court hearing would reshape everything. And so they spent the borrowed hours with a kind of careful presence. The way people spent time they knew was finite, attentively. Without waste. It began the evening after the courtyard conversation. She had returned to the lower library to finish the covenant document cross-referencing, and found him already there. 2 lamps lit rather than one, a second chair positioned closer to the main table than before. Not a grand gesture, simply a chair moved 6 inches in her direction. And something about the smallness of it arrived in her chest more precisely than anything theatrical could have managed. He taught her the old vampire rules that night. Not the house law texts she'd been reading. Those were architecture, the formal structures. He taught her the living customs, the etiquette of vampire society that wasn't written anywhere because it had been transmitted through centuries of practice, through the particular socialization of a world that operated outside human record. The feeding rules first, he said, because they're the most misunderstood and the most relevant to your safety within court circles. She had her pen ready. He noticed and said, with something approaching dry humor, "You don't need to write this down. I'm going to write it down." A pause. Then, with the air of someone revising an expectation, the hollow court operates under the consent covenant of 1347. Every house signed it. Every feeding requires verbal and conscious consent, freely given without coercion, chemical influence, or hypnotic compulsion. Violation is the gravest offense in the court's legal code, graver than the murder of a mortal, which carries its own severe consequences. Graver than house treason. Why graver than murder? She asked. Because murder ends a person. Unconsented feeding violates what a person is while leaving them to continue being it. He said it without inflection, as something he had believed for a very long time. The founding houses understood that the relationship between vampire and human had to be built on something other than predation, or it would consume itself. The consent covenant was the explicit acknowledgement of that. She wrote it down. He told her about the night courts, how they function not merely as judicial bodies but as social architecture. The formal gatherings where house business was transacted and disputes aired, and the elaborate, centuries-old protocols of vampire society performed with the kind of investment that only immortality could sustain. He described the court's physical space, an underground chamber beneath Velmore's oldest quarter. Its ceiling, a vault of living stone threaded with bioluminescent sigil work. Its floor, a mosaic of house emblems inlaid in materials she would recognize as valuable, and several she would not. It will be intimidating, he said. Deliberately so. The court is designed to remind every party present that they are operating within a power structure significantly older and more complex than any individual grievance, including mine, especially yours. From their perspective, he met her eyes. You will be the only mortal present. They will look at you as Ashford looked at you, as a variable, a means, a temporary entity in a permanent game. A pause. They will be wrong, but they will begin with that assumption, and you'll be beside me. I will be beside you, he confirmed. Something in the confirmation was not merely legal or strategic. She heard the register beneath it, the layer that was personal, specific. Chosen and filed it alongside the moved chair and the 2 cups on the table and the borrowed coat and all the other small, accumulating evidence of a man learning incrementally to let someone matter. She taught him something that second evening. Though she didn't frame it as teaching, they were in the main hall after midnight. She had come down for water and found him in the place she'd privately begun to think of as his thinking spot, the deep window seat overlooking the city, and she sat beside him without asking and looked at what he was looking at. Velmore at 2 in the morning. A city dreaming, its lights reduced to the scattered necessities of night workers and insomniacs, and the particular luminous quality of streets emptied of their daytime noise. What do you do? She asked. When you're not managing house politics, or preparing court cases, or protecting 14,000 people who don't know you exist. He considered this with genuine attention, as if the question required excavation. I read. I maintain the house archive. I walk the city at night sometimes. I have, across the centuries, learned 11 languages, 3 instrument forms, and a considerable amount of cartography. He paused. None of it is what I would call. I don't know that I have a word for what you're asking about. Joy, she said simply. I'm asking what brings you joy. The word landed in the quiet between them like a stone into still water, and she watched the ripples of it move through his expression. Not unfamiliarity. He knew the word clearly. Something more specific. The expression of someone for whom joy had become so theoretical over such a span of time that being asked about it directly was briefly disorienting. I don't know, he said honestly. I have not asked myself that question, and he stopped. I don't remember the last time I asked it. She looked at him steadily. Then that's what we're going to figure out. Before tomorrow ends and the court takes everything else. He looked back at her. In the dark of the window seat, in the city's quiet luminescence, his face had the unguarded quality she had come to recognize as his most honest register. Not the controlled authority of house lord. Not the careful distance of a man who had learned solitude as a survival strategy, but the older thing beneath both. The face of someone who had been, once, simply a person, who had wanted things, and felt things, and known what joy felt like before centuries of isolation had made the concept abstract. Show me, he said quietly. Not a command, a request. She reached out and took his hand. He went very still, the absolute stillness of something unused to being touched without agenda. She turned his hand over, palm upward, and pointed through the window at the city below. Tell me 3 things you can see that you find not beautiful necessarily. Interesting, worth the looking. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, the gaslight on the cobblestones near the old quarter. It does something to the reflection in the wet stone. A pause. The clock tower's shadow. It moves differently at night. Longer geometry. Another pause. This one briefer, more certain. The way you're looking at the city right now. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she recognized fully for the first time. Not reassessment. Not fractional softening. Not controlled admiration held at careful distance. Longing. Open. Unmanaged. And entirely real. She held his hand and didn't let go. He didn't pull away. Outside, Velmore breathed its slow night breath. And inside the window seat of an ancient house on the hill above it, something that had been frozen for longer than civilization had been recorded began. Very carefully to thaw. That's joy, she said softly. The finding of things worth the looking. You haven't lost it. It's just been waiting. He looked at their joined hands, and then at her, and said nothing, because nothing was required. And because he was learning slowly, incrementally, against every instinct built by 18 centuries of necessary solitude, that some silences were not empty at all. Chapter 10. On her own terms, the night court was exactly as he had described it, and nothing like it. The chamber beneath Velmore's oldest quarter breathed cold and ancient air. Its vaulted ceiling threaded with bioluminescent sigil work that cast everything in a silver-blue light that made the assembled vampires look like what they were. Old things. Beautiful and dangerous, wearing the costumes of the contemporary world over natures that predated it by centuries. The house emblems in the mosaic floor caught the light as Serafini crossed them, and she felt each one beneath her feet with the awareness of someone walking through a territory that had never been designed with her kind in mind. She wore deep blue. Dia had selected it with the deliberate strategy of someone who understood that clothing was armor of a specific kind, not Voss family ivory, not borrowed anonymity, but something that said, I am present, I am intentional, I am not a variable in your equation. Her mother's annotated house laws were in the leather folio under her arm. The dissolution clause was signed and witnessed, tucked into the folios in her pocket. Caius walked beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched. Not touching, he had not touched her since the window seat, maintaining a careful distance she understood as respect for the line between what had been wordlessly acknowledged and what had not yet been spoken. But the nearness of him was deliberate. She felt the court register it. Felt the calibration of 200 immortal eyes re-evaluating what they thought they were observing. Good, Mordecai. Vale was already at the opposing days. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she had expected. Something overtly threatening, perhaps. Something that wore its malevolence visibly. What she found instead was a man of apparent middle age, with a pleasant face and the eyes of something that had spent 400 years learning to make pleasant faces, and who looked at her from across the chamber with an expression of mild, professional interest that was more frightening than hostility would have been. House Marin, said the court arbiter ancient, androgynous, draped in the court's formal silver, presents prior claim on behalf of Serafini a Lara Voss, mortal, formerly of the Voss household. House Vale contests on grounds of improper invocation. A pause. House Marin will speak first. Caius stepped forward. She watched him address the court with the authority of 1800 years and the precision of someone who had spent 9 days building this argument specifically for this room. The maternal protection, the covenant continuity, the blood right inheritance that the 1847 annotated edition suppress clause actually supported if you read the original Aramaic conditional correctly, which she had found, cross-referenced, and translated herself 3 days ago in the lower library at 2 in the morning. He presented her work without crediting it as hers. She stepped forward. I have a supplement, she said. The court's 200 eyes shifted to her. The silence had texture. She opened the folio. The 1347 Consent Covenant, Article 9, Subsection 4. The original Aramaic text contains a conditional clause regarding informal protections and bloodline inheritance that was omitted in all subsequent translations. I have the original and 3 independent translations prepared by scholars whose credentials are in the attached documentation. She placed the papers on the arbiter's table with the steadiness of someone who had stopped being frightened of rooms designed to frighten her. The clause establishes that informal protection extends by bloodline continuity for a period of 7 years following the protected party's death, renewable by the House Lord's declaration. My mother died 26 months ago. The protection was never formally lapsed. Lord Marin's prior claim is not merely technically valid, it is the legally required action under the original covenant terms. The chamber was absolutely silent. Mordecai's pleasant expression had not changed. His eyes had. The document, the arbiter said, will be verified. Of course, Serafini said. I'd recommend the court's own Aramaic scholars for the translation verification. I've provided the line references. She stepped back. Caius did not look at her, but beside her, she felt the shift in him, the fractional easing of tension in his posture, the particular quality of a man who had prepared for a battle and found an ally had already ended it by different means. Mordecai knew it too. She watched him recalculate across the chamber floor and saw the precise moment he moved to the contingency. He moved fast. Not the theatrical announcement of violence, but the real version, crossing the chamber in the time it took her to inhale, bypassing 3 court wardens through a speed differential that made the warden's response irrelevant before it began, heading not for Caius, but for her. The folio, the document, the proof that invalidated his 400-year strategy. She had 2 seconds. She used the first to step sideways, clearing Caius's line of movement. She used the second to close the folio and slide it behind her back to Dia, who had materialized from the observation gallery with the excellent timing of someone who had anticipated exactly this contingency and positioned accordingly. Mordecai's hand closed on empty air, and then Caius was between them. What followed was not long. High-order vampire against high-order vampire in the presence of 200 witnesses and the full weight of court law was not a fight that could be sustained. The political cost of it mounted with every second. And Mordecai, for all his 4 centuries of strategic brilliance, had just moved against a mortal witness inside the night court chamber itself. The arbiter's voice cracked through the chamber like struck stone, invoking the court's emergency jurisdiction. And 6 court wardens hit Mordecai with combined sigil force that dropped even a 400-year vampire to his knees. It ended in 40 seconds. Caius turned back to her. He was unmarked. His expression was the controlled fury she'd catalogued, but beneath it relief. Specific, personal, directed entirely at her. The folio? He said quietly, with Dia. She looked across the chamber to where Dia stood with the leather case held firmly against her chest, expression conveying a composed satisfaction. The document is intact. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who smiled easily or often, but that occupied the same warm, specific territory. Of course it is. The court proceedings took another 2 hours. The arbiter verified the Aramaic translation with 3 court scholars, who confirmed her interpretation within 40 minutes. The prior claim was upheld. Mordecai Vale was remanded to court custody pending a formal hearing on the unauthorized chamber attack and the newly authenticated evidence that his 400-year campaign to suppress the founding covenant clauses constituted a systematic violation of house law at the highest level. When the chamber finally emptied, Serafini stood in the sigil-lit quiet, with the folio returned to her hands and the particular hollowness of adrenaline fully metabolized, and felt not triumph exactly, but the solid, grounded sensation of having done what she came to do on terms she had defined herself. Caius was beside her. The 200 observers were gone. Just the 2 of them, and the bioluminescent ceiling and the house emblems underfoot. "It's over," she said. "The immediate crisis," he agreed. "The larger restructuring of court politics will take considerably longer. The suppress clauses, once formally entered into the record, rebalance a significant amount of existing house hierarchy." A pause. "My standing among the houses will shift. Some of those shifts will be adversarial. You've managed adversarial for 1800 years, with considerably less effective legal research." He turned to face her. In the chamber's silver-blue light, with the formal authority of the court setting dissolved and the careful distance of crisis management no longer required, he looked like what the window seat had briefly shown her, simply a person, old beyond imagination, complicated beyond easy accounting, and looking at her with an expression that had finished calculating and arrived somewhere irreducible. "The oath bond," he said. "You have the dissolution clause. The path to your previous life, to a life outside all of this, is fully open." She met his eyes. "My previous life was a 40-pound gown and a transaction dressed as a wedding. A life you build yourself then, anywhere, under house protection, without proximity. Without," he stopped. "Selected honesty over protocol, as he had been doing, incrementally, for 9 days. Without me." The word landed between them with the weight of everything it contained. 1800 years of solitude. 2 days in a window seat, a hand held in the dark above a city that didn't know it was protected. The specific grief of a man who had built his ethics on the premise that loneliness was the price of principle, and was discovering, too late and too fully, that the premise might not have been structurally sound. "I want the oath bond to stand," she said. "Not because I need the legal protection. Because I choose it." She held his gaze steadily, the way she had learned to hold every difficult thing without flinching, without looking away. "But I want to be clear about the terms." He waited. "Partnership," she said, "not possession. I walk into your world, but I walk into it standing up, on my own feet, making my own choices. The dissolution clause stays in the record, not because I intend to use it, but because the existence of the choice is what makes the staying meaningful." She paused. "I am not your ward. I am not a human under house protection. I am someone who has decided with full information, with no debt and no coercion and no 40-pound gown to stand beside you." The silence that followed was not empty. "On your own terms," he said softly. "On my own terms." He reached out slowly, with the same announcing deliberateness she had learned was his version of asking, and took her hand. His grip was steady and cool and entirely without agenda. The same touch as the courtyard after the siege, but different now. Not confirmation that something real was still real. Declaration that it was real. That it was chosen. That it was going to continue being chosen. "The houses will not be quiet for long," he said. "I know. This life is not safe. It is complicated and old and full of things that are difficult by nature." "Caius," she held his hand firmly. "I spent 2 years in a quiet life that was destroying me by degrees. I know the difference between difficult and dangerous. I'll take dangerous over the other kind." He looked at her, fully, openly, with the face of someone who had stopped performing indifference and found that the thing beneath it had been waiting with extraordinary patience. "Then stay," he said simply. "Not because the law requires it. Because you've decided it." "I've decided it," she confirmed. Outside the night court chamber, Velmore was waking to its morning. The 7 houses would convene over the authenticated clauses. The political architecture of the hollow court would shift and settle into new configurations. Mordecai Vale would face judgment. The 14,000 people living under protection, agreements they would never know about, would continue their lives in the safety of a covenant upheld by law and by choice. and by a woman who had walked into an ancient world with a leather folio and her mother's research and refused to be a variable in anyone else's equation. She walked out of the chamber, holding his hand, into the cold blue morning of a city full of lives worth protecting, on her own terms, with him beside her. Serafini Voss did not become immortal. She did not become a creature of the night, or surrender the mortal life she was owed. She became something rarer, a human woman with full knowledge of the dark, standing in it willingly, beside a man who had waited 1800 years to stop being alone and had not known, until she arrived, that waiting was what he had been doing.